They laughed when I chose this shed, but under its floor, Grandpa hid $847 million.
The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and old mild coffee, and Marin Calloway had learned over 4 years of night shifts that the quietest hours were never truly quiet. Machines whispered. Patients turned in their sleep. The building itself seemed to breathe. It was 2 in the morning when the call came through the desk phone at the nurse's station. Not an emergency tone, just a soft double ring that meant one of the stable patients was asking for someone. The attendant on duty looked up at Marin. Room 114, Mr. Calloway is asking for you. Marin set down the patient chart she had been reviewing and walked the length of the corridor without hurrying. She had learned not to hurry toward rooms like that one. Hurrying sent the wrong signal to the person waiting inside. She wanted her grandfather to see her walk through that door the way she always walked through it. Steady, present, like she had all the time in the world. Prentice Calloway was sitting up in bed when she entered, not propped up against pillows the way the nurses arranged him during the day. Sitting up under his own strength spine straight, both hands folded in his lap. His eyes were open and clear in a way that surprised her. For the past 2 weeks, those eyes had carried the specific dimness of a man who had accepted something. Tonight they were sharp focused, trained on the doorway, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment and had been patient enough to let it arrive on its own schedule. Close the door, he said. She closed it. Sit down, Marin. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. The room held only the sound of his oxygen monitor and the distant murmur of the city outside the window. Iowa City in November, wind pressing against the glass. Prentice reached out his right hand. The skin across his knuckles was thin as paper, the joints swollen from decades of work. But the grip that closed around her fingers was firm, in a way that she felt all the way up her arm. A carpenter's grip, an engineer's grip, the grip of a man who had spent 50 years building things that lasted. When they read the will, he said, they will laugh at you. Marin looked at him. Grandpa, let me finish. His voice was low and careful, each word placed like a tool returned to its proper position. They will offer you something that sounds reasonable. You will be tempted, and everything inside you that is practical and tired and grieving will tell you to take it. He paused. Don't. The oxygen monitor beeped once. Outside the window, a car passed on the wet street below. Choose the shed, Prentice said. Whatever they offer you, whatever they say about it, whatever they laugh about, choose the shed. Trust me, Marin. One more time. Trust me. She felt the pressure of his hand change. And when she looked down, she saw something small and metal pressed into her palm. A key. Brass-old, perhaps 2 inches long, with a simple bow and a shaft worn smooth from handling. It was heavier than a key that size had any right to be. The daisy shows the way, he said. You'll understand when you get there. And the combination is your birthday the way I always write it. She looked up at him. His eyes had softened. Whatever urgency had pulled him upright was settling back into something quieter now, like a wave that had delivered what it carried and was returning to the sea. You can go back to work, he said. I'm all right. Grandpa, what are you? Go back to work, Marin. She stood slowly, still holding the key. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone when some part of you already knows you are cataloging the image. I'll come back before the end of my shift, she said. He nodded. He had already closed his eyes. She walked back to the nurse's station with a small brass key in her coat pocket and a question she could not yet form sitting somewhere behind her sternum. Prentice Calloway died peacefully, 14 days later in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in November with the Iowa sky outside his window, the pale gray of old iron. He was 84 years old. He had been an engineer, a farmer, a grandfather, and for reasons that would not become clear until much later, a man who had spent 40 years keeping a secret with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment was worth waiting for. Marin had asked for that morning off from her shift. She had sat in the chair beside his bed from 4 o'clock until 6, when the light changed and the monitors went still. She had held his hand the way he had held hers 2 weeks before. Firm, present, like she had all the time in the world. She was the only family member in the room. The others arrived that afternoon. Alton drove up from Des Moines in his silver Mercedes, parking with the precision of a man who considered parking a statement of character. He was 42, a corporate attorney with a salary that appeared on paper to make him comfortable, but had never once made him satisfied. He wore charcoal wool and carried himself with the posture of a man perpetually prepared to be the most important person in any room he entered. Isadora came from Chicago on an early flight, arriving in a cream-colored coat and sunglasses despite the November overcast trailing a carry-on that probably cost more than Marin's monthly rent. She was 39 and ran a luxury real estate firm and had the specific quality of attention that some successful women develop the ability to look at everything in a room and calculate its value without appearing to do so. The cousins arrived together. Wade Simone and Brooks Pruitt, children of Prentice's late sister, who had grown up coming to Callaway Creek every other Christmas and had maintained over the years the exact level of closeness with their uncle that allowed them to feel entitled to his estate without having invested enough to feel guilty about it. Wade was 34 and a certified accountant. He had been documenting the tasting menu at an upscale restaurant in Des Moines when Marin texted the family group chat about Prentice's condition deteriorating. He had posted the photo anyway before driving out. And then there was Leland Calloway. Leland was 67, Prentice's firstborn, and the only person in the family who had known Prentice as a young man rather than as a grandfather or a wealthy uncle. He had grown up at Callaway Creek before leaving for Northwestern at 18, followed by a law degree, a career in Chicago real estate litigation, 2 marriages, and a life that had carried him steadily further from Iowa with each passing decade. He had not visited his father in the last 2 years. Not for lack of opportunity, for lack of the specific kind of courage that returning home requires. And he arrived separately from the cousins in a rented black sedan, and he found Marin in the family waiting room before the others had organized themselves into a group. He was wearing a gray suit that fit him well and carrying the particular stillness of a man who had decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. Marnit, he said, he sat across from her rather than beside her, a negotiating choice. I want to say how much I appreciate what you did for my father these past months. Genuinely, it could not have been easy. It wasn't hard, she said. I wanted to be here. Leland nodded. He paused in the way that attorneys pause, giving space without surrendering control of it. I think we both know that the will reading tomorrow is going to be emotional for everyone. My father was a deliberate man. Whatever he decided, he will have had reasons for it. Another pause. What I want you to understand, and I say this with real respect for everything you gave him, is that the bulk of what he built belongs by tradition and by law to his direct line. To me and to Alton and Isadora, a portion to the cousins naturally, and something for you certainly, something meaningful. Marin looked at him. You're warning me. Leland held her gaze without blinking. I'm managing expectations. There's a difference. Have you been inside the shed on the east boundary recently? She asked. The change in his expression was small. A fraction of a second, a quality of attention that sharpened and then deliberately relaxed the way a card player's hand changes when they see something unexpected in their opponent's hold. The old workshop, numb, why would I? Just curious, she said. He stood. He smoothed the front of his jacket. Tomorrow will be fine, he said. I think we'll all be surprised by the generosity my father showed, even toward the more peripheral members of the family. He said it without cruelty, almost gently, which was somehow worse. After he left the room, Marin sat alone for a while. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the key. Peripheral. She turned the word over. She thought about the summer she was 7 years old, the first summer her mother brought her to Callaway Creek after the diagnosis, when her mother was still strong enough to make the drive, but already beginning the slow process of becoming someone who needed help instead of giving it. Prentice had met them in the driveway. He had not looked at his daughter with pity. He had looked at her with the steady warmth of a man who intended to be useful. Then he had looked down at Marin and said, I hear you like to read. And she had nodded. And he had taken her hand and led her to the workshop, which was then still an active place full of blueprints and tools and the smell of metal and possibility. And he had shown her a shelf of engineering texts and said, these are mine, you can read any of them. I'll explain the parts you don't understand. She had been 7. She had not understood any of it, but she had read anyway, sitting on the floor of that workshop, while Prentice worked at the bench above her, and she had asked him questions, and he had answered every single one. That was the thing about Prentice Callaway that no one in the family seemed to have noticed, or perhaps had noticed and grown tired of. He answered questions. He treated questions as worthy of real answers, not as interruptions, not as opportunities to demonstrate his knowledge, but as genuine exchanges between people who were both interested in the same thing. He made you feel that your curiosity was valuable. She remembered a summer when she was 16 and angry in the way that teenagers are angry at nothing specific and everything at once. She had gone to find Prentice in the old workshop and stood in the doorway without knowing what she wanted, and he had looked up from whatever he was working on and said without preamble, "Hand me that 3/8 wrench." She had crossed the floor and handed it to him, and for the next 2 hours he had talked her through what he was repairing, a water pump coupling that had cracked, and the conversation had moved without Marin noticing from the pump to the principles behind it, to the larger question of why things break and how you know when something is worth fixing versus when you should let it go. By the time the workshop light had dimmed to orange, she had forgotten entirely that she had been angry. She drove home with the specific lightness of someone who has been reminded that the world is more interesting than whatever was bothering them. She remembered being 23 home for Christmas and watching Prentice sit across from Leland at the dinner table, while Leland talked about a real estate deal in language designed to impress and exclude simultaneously. Prentice had listened with the complete attention he gave to everything, nodding occasionally, and when Leland finished, Prentice had said only, "And do you enjoy it?" Leland had paused, visibly uncertain, and said, "Yes, of course." And Prentice had nodded again and passed the bread basket and said nothing further. Marin had thought about that exchange for years afterward. Not the question, the pause before the answer. In 22 years of summers and holidays, in the last 6 months of daily presence at his bedside, Marin had never once stopped being curious about him, and he had never once stopped answering. The will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock the following afternoon in the main sitting room of Callaway Creek. The farmhouse itself was the kind of place that had absorbed a century of human history and wore it comfortably wide plank oak floors, stone fireplace, windows that looked out over the remaining acreage with the quiet authority of something that had decided long ago it was here to stay. Marin arrived to find someone she did not recognize already in the room. I was perhaps 50 medium height, with the groomed appearance of a man who considered his image a professional tool. He sat in the corner with a leather briefcase across his knees and a yellow legal pad on the arm of the chair, and he was looking at the framed map of the Callaway Creek property that hung above the secretary desk near the window. Specifically, he was looking at the eastern boundary of the property, specifically at the area marked with what Marin could now see from across the room was a circle drawn in pencil. The line was faint, the pencil marks pale with age, the kind of mark made weeks or months ago and left to settle into the paper. Alton intercepted her before she could approach the man. "Franklin Tully, real estate consultant out of Des Moines. I asked him to come for context. Property of this size, you want someone in the room who understands the market." "Before the will is read," Marin said. "It's preparation, not presumption." Alton's smile was the professional kind. "Franklin, this is our cousin Marin. She's been looking after Dad." Tully stood and extended his hand. His grip was precisely calibrated. Not too firm, not too soft. A handshake that had been practiced. "Miss Callaway, I understand you have been invaluable these last months. It's a real loss. Your grandfather was a remarkable man." "How was," she said. She watched Tully sit back down. She watched his eyes return almost immediately to the eastern boundary on the map. And she thought about the circle in pencil and about Leland asking why. She was curious about the shed and about the key in her pocket that she had not told a single person about. Harold Paxton, the attorney who had drafted Prentice's will, arrived at 1:50 with a leather satchel and the measured composure of a man who had sat through many family gatherings of this kind and had learned to maintain a careful neutrality. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the specific quality of stillness that very good lawyers develop when they are about to deliver information that will not land evenly. He arranged his papers at the dining table that had been cleared for the occasion. The family settled around it with the performance of casualness that people adopt when they are trying very hard not to look like they are waiting for something. Marin took a chair near the window. She could see the east field from where she sat. Somewhere out past the tree line, the shed stood in the gray November light. Paxton began. The bequests unrolled with the practiced pacing of a document designed to be read aloud. Leland received the farming equipment in $400,000. Alton received the farmhouse itself in $800,000 from the primary accounts. Isadora received the 3 vintage automobiles, the California property, in $600,000. The cousins received their various portions Wade 400,000 in the downtown commercial property, Simone 300,000 in the investment portfolio, Brooks 200,000 in the Colorado recreational holdings. The room accumulated satisfaction with each name called. Isadora had already sent Alton a quick look over the table that said everything about expectations confirmed. Wade had stopped pretending to be neutral and was simply smiling. What then Marin noticed was watching Paxton rather than reacting to his own bequest. Watching him the way a person watches a road they have driven before checking for changes. Paxton turned the last page. The quality of his voice shifted, not dramatically, just enough. And finally, for my granddaughter Marin Calloway, who asked about my life when no one else cared to listen, who stayed when staying required nothing except love, I leave a choice. The room went very quiet. Marin may choose between a cash payment of $75,000 to be paid immediately upon closing of the estate, or she may choose to inherit the old workshop on the eastern boundary of the property, together with the half-acre of land on which it stands and all contents therein. For exactly 2 seconds, no one made a sound. Then Alton laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, which would have been easier to bear. It was a genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who finds something unexpectedly absurd. The shed, he said. Dad left her the shed. Isadora's expression moved through something that might have been sympathy before settling on amusement. Marin, I'm sorry. That building is a hazard. We were going to have it demolished, the roof alone. Wade had his phone out, which told Marin everything she needed to know about Wade. Tully set down his legal pad. I did a walkthrough of the eastern parcel last week, actually. The shed structure itself is compromised, and the half-acre has no road access and no development potential. He paused, choosing the word, with the care of a professional, it's not a viable asset. Take the money, Marin Alton said. His tone had shifted into something almost avuncular, the tone of a man being patient with someone who needs guidance. 75,000 is real. The shed is a liability. You'd have to pay to have it demolished. Paxton looked at Marin over his glasses. His face gave nothing away, but his head moved barely in a motion so small that no one else in the room would have registered it as anything at all. Marin registered it. She put her hand into her coat pocket. The key was cold. She thought about Prentice sitting up in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning with clear eyes and a firm grip, choosing his last clear night to tell her one thing. I choose the shed, she said. The laughter that followed was louder than before, warmer almost in the way that shared amusement creates a temporary warmth between people. Wade was almost certainly already composing a caption. Simone covered her smile with her hand in a gesture that was probably meant to seem kind. Brooks said something under his breath that Marin did not catch. Alton spread his hands in a gesture of resigned bafflement. Marin, $75,000. I choose the shed and the land, she said again. Her voice was the same both times. Paxton noted it in the record. Leland said nothing. He was looking at Marin, not with amusement, not with sympathy, with the specific attention of a man reassessing a situation he had believed he understood. The meeting dissolved into the practical arrangements that follow the reading of a will paperwork and timelines and handshakes with Tully about property assessments. Marin stood near the window and watched the east field, the tree line, the gray sky above the place where the shed was standing. Alton found her there with a sheet of paper, which he handed to her without particular ceremony. You need to have your things out of your room before 6. I'll be changing the locks tonight. He said it without hostility, which was its own kind of statement. It was simply administration. She was simply a variable being resolved. All right, she said. He nodded and moved away. And then Leland was beside her, and his voice was quieter than it had been in the waiting room, and the professional ease was gone from it. Marin, if there is anything in that shed, any documentation, any papers of any kind that relate to the estate or to my father's assets, you have a legal and ethical obligation to disclose them to the family. I want you to understand that clearly. She looked at him. Why would there be documentation in the shed, Leland? His jaw tightened slightly. I'm speaking generally. You asked specifically, she said, about documentation, about assets. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward where Tully was gathering his papers near the desk. Marin turned back to the window. The pencil circle on the map had been drawn weeks ago, maybe months. Someone had stood at that map and drawn a circle around the east boundary of Calloway Creek long before today, long before the will was read, long before the room full of people had laughed at a 28-year-old nurse for choosing a falling down shed over $75,000 in cash. Someone had looked at that parcel and decided it was worth circling, worth noting, worth coming back to. She thought about Tully's professional pause before the word viable, the half-beat of hesitation that a very good bluffer cannot entirely eliminate. She packed her room in 40 minutes. 2 bags, her nursing certification on top where it wouldn't crease. She carried them to her car in the gray afternoon light and set them in the trunk and stood for a moment with her hand on the lid. Her phone buzzed. Gretchen Bellows, her charge nurse, and the closest thing to a mentor she had found in 4 years at Iowa Methodist. I saw Wade's video, the shed thing. Are you okay? Marin leaned against the car. Down the gravel drive, she could see Alton on the porch of the farmhouse that was now his, talking to someone on the phone with the expansive body language of a man announcing good news. I don't know yet, she said. Prentice Calloway was the least random person I've ever met, Gretchen said. I administered his flu shot 2 years running. We talked for 20 minutes both times. That man did not do anything without a reason. I know. Where are you going to stay? I have somewhere, Marin said. She did not tell Gretchen it was the shed. She drove the dirt road to the eastern boundary with the windows down, despite the cold. The shed appeared through the trees the way it always had, lower than she remembered from childhood, the roof line sagging in one corner, the wood darkened by weather and time. Weeds had grown up around the foundation in a way that made the whole structure look like it was in the process of returning to the earth. She got out of the car. The padlock on the door was old iron filmed with rust, but it sat in its hasp with the solidity of something that had been placed with intention. She took the brass key from her pocket. It went into the lock the way the right key always does, with the slight resistance of old mechanism, and then the clean click of tumblers aligning. The door opened. The smell reached her first, wood and machine oil and time, and underneath those things, something she did not have a name for, the smell of a space that had been used with great concentration for a long time, and then closed carefully like the covers of a book whose story is finished, but whose words are still inside. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. Workbenches along the walls. Tools hung above them on pegboard, each outline traced in faded marker. Every implement returned to its place. The floor was dusty, but not chaotic. Nothing here had been abandoned. Everything had been set down with the expectation that someone would eventually come looking for it. She swept her phone's flashlight across the far wall, and then she stopped. On one of the main support beams at chest height, someone had carved a small flower into the wood, 5 petals, a simple stem. The lines were precise and unhurried, the mark of a man who had made this same drawing hundreds of times on birthday cards and napkins and hospital plaster, who had given it as a signature the way other people give their names. Marin crossed the floor and put her fingertips on the carving. The wood around it was different, subtly so, smoother, denser, not old wood at all, but new wood installed to look old. She pressed it. Click. 3 feet of floorboard shifted beneath her. She knelt, found the edge, lifted. Under the floor, set flush into the concrete foundation, was a steel safe with a combination dial, old style, 4 numbers. She sat back on her heels and thought about Prentice's voice. The combination is your birthday, the way I always write it. I had always written dates the old way. Month and day only. Her birthday was April 7th. She dialed 0407. The safe opened. Inside was a metal document box. The kind built for permanence, and resting across the top of it was a brown leather journal with no markings on the cover. She lifted the journal out first. It was heavier than she expected, thick, with decades of entries, the spine soft with handling. She opened it to the first page. The date was January 1975. The handwriting was her grandfather's, precise, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote and meant what he put down. She read the first paragraph standing in the open floor of the shed with her phone's flashlight and the November wind finding its way through the gaps in the walls. She read the second. She read the third. By the time she reached the bottom of the first page, she had sat down on the floor without realizing it. Outside, the sky darkened toward evening. Somewhere a quarter-mile away in the farmhouse that now belonged to her brother, there were champagne glasses and congratulations, and the comfortable assumption that everything had gone according to plan. Marin Calloway sat on the floor of a shed that everyone had dismissed as worthless, reading the first page of a story that had been 40 years in the making, waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for her. The first thing Myron learned from the journal was that her grandfather had been afraid. Not of death, not of the family circling the estate like birds reading weather. He had been afraid of something quieter and more particular, that he would die before finding the right person, and that everything he had built in silence would end up in the hands of people who would treat it the way they treated everything else, as a transaction. She read, sitting on the shed floor with her back against the workbench and her phone flashlight propped against the document box, and the wind pressed against the walls around her, and she did not feel the cold. January 1975, Prentice had been 33 years old when he wrote the first entry, a young engineer at Davenport Chemical who had spent 8 years developing a water filtration system in whatever hours his regular work left him. The science itself he described briefly and only once, the way a man describes something he has lived with long enough that it no longer requires introduction. An industrial process for purifying contaminated wastewater at 10 times the efficiency of existing systems and at roughly a third of the cost. 12 patents filed under his personal name, not the company's. The key insight, he wrote, was not the chemistry, but the timing. Environmental regulation was coming, not immediately, but inevitably. And when it arrived, every petrochemical plant and mining operation and heavy manufacturing facility in the developed world would need exactly what he had built. He had not sold the patents. He had licensed them on long-term royalty agreements, structured so that every installation, every replacement component, every maintenance contract would generate income in perpetuity. Then he had opened a separate trust account that no one in his family knew existed and begun depositing the monthly royalties into it. I had been doing this for 40 years. Marin read the figure twice. $847 million. And the number sat in the middle of the page in Prentice's precise handwriting, recorded not with drama, but with the same matter-of-fact clarity he had brought to every entry, like a measurement, like the reading on a gauge that had been climbing steadily for decades and had simply arrived at this number. She set the journal down on her knee. Outside, a light was on in the farmhouse. She could see it through the shed's small window, a warm yellow rectangle in the dark. Someone was moving past it, Alton probably, or Isadora, walking through rooms that were now legally theirs, making plans in the easy confidence of people who believe the accounting is finished. She picked up the journal again. The entries from the late 70s were technical in places, documenting the expansion of the licensing agreements, the first major contracts with Gulf Coast petrochemical companies, the slow architecture of the trust. But they were also something else. They were the private record of a man watching his family from a careful distance and drawing conclusions. March 1982, Leland asked me again today about the patents, not what they are or what they do, what they're worth. I told him the licensing income was modest and reinvested. He accepted this without further questions, which told me everything. Leland is not curious about how things work. He is curious about how much things cost. April 1989, Alton came home from his first year of law school with a handshake that had changed. Firmer than before. Practiced. He shook my hand at the door and I felt the calculation in it, and I thought someone taught him that. Someone told him a handshake is a statement. I wanted to tell him it's actually a question, but he was already past me and asking about the car in the garage. June 1997, Marin is 7 years old. She took one of my engineering texts off the shelf and sat in the corner reading it for an hour. She didn't understand it, but she sat with it anyway, the way you sit with a piece of music you haven't learned to hear yet. When I asked what she thought, she said the drawings were beautiful. She meant the technical diagrams. I looked at them for the first time in years and thought, she's right. They are beautiful. No one has ever said that to me before. Marin stopped reading. She had not remembered that conversation. She had been 7. She remembered the shelf and the dusty smell of old paper and the quality of afternoon light in this place when it had been an active workshop. But she had not remembered saying that. She had not known Prentice remembered it either. She had not known it meant anything to him. She sat with that for a while. Then she kept reading. The middle years of the journal were harder. Prentice's wife, Virginia, died in 2003, and the entries from that period were brief and tightly controlled, the handwriting of a man holding himself in with both hands. What came through even in brevity was the shape of the loss. Virginia had known about the trust. She had known everything. She had been the only person in 40 years who had looked at what Prentice was building and understood it not as money but as intention. Her death had left him alone with the weight of it in a way he had not fully anticipated. He had kept going. He had kept writing. August 2015, Marin came for a visit and we talked until 2 in the morning. She asked me something no one has asked in 40 years. She asked if I had any regrets. I sat with the question honestly the way it deserved, and I told her that my only real regret was that I had not explained myself better to my children when they were young, that I had let them draw their own conclusions about what I valued and why, and the conclusions they drew were wrong. And by the time I understood that the habit of distance was already set, she listened to all of it. She did not try to fix it or argue it or reframe it. She just listened. Then she said, "Tell me about the patents." And I did. For the first time in 40 years, I told someone the whole story out loud in the order it happened. It took 4 hours. She asked the right questions at every stage. At 2 in the morning, I looked at this woman who had been a 7-year-old sitting on my floor reading diagrams upside down, and I thought, there it is. There is the person. The entry that followed was dated August 2019. Leland called today about the East parcel. He said Franklin Tully, a broker he has been working with out of Des Moines, wants to develop the land for logistics infrastructure. He said I was sitting on acreage that could benefit the whole family. When I told him no, he said I wasn't thinking about the people who would come after me. I told him that was exactly what I was doing. He hung up. He does not know the shed is on that parcel. He does not know what the shed contains, but he knows the east boundary is something I have consistently declined to discuss, and that kind of pattern is enough for a man like Leland to develop a theory. I don't know how much of the theory is right, but I need to move faster than I planned. Marin turned the page. I have retained Arthur Merritt at Merritt and Associates in Iowa City. He comes with the best recommendation I have ever received for an attorney, which is that he has never once told a client what they wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. I have given him the complete picture. He understands the stakes. The trust documents, the patent portfolio, the retainer agreement, all of it goes into the safe. If anyone attempts to interfere with what I have arranged, Merritt is already in position. And then the entry she had been both looking for and avoiding. November 2022, 3 days the doctors tell me, maybe 4. Marin changed my dressings this morning and talked to me the whole time. Not to distract me. Just because she had things to say and she wanted to say them while there was still time. She talked about a patient she lost last week, a man named Gerald, who had worked on cargo ships for 30 years and had no family at the end. She said she held his hand. She said she hoped someone would hold hers. I thought about telling her then, about all of it, but I didn't because the test is not in the telling. The test is in the choosing. She has to choose the shed without knowing what's in it. She has to choose it because I asked her to, because she trusts me more than she trusts the money, because that is the quality that will let her handle what comes after. If she chooses the cash, she is sensible and practical, and I love her exactly the same. But if she chooses the shed, then she is who I think she is, and she gets everything. I am going to ask her tonight. I've been carrying the key for 3 months. Marin closed the journal. She sat in the shed in the dark for a long time, not reading, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting in the space where her grandfather had worked for 40 years while his family grew up and made their assumptions and never once asked what he was building. She cried, not loudly, the particular quiet of a person who has learned to grieve in hospital corridors and has become efficient at it. She let it move through her and settle, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and opened the document box. The patent certificates were there, 12 of them, official and dense with technical language, each bearing the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the name Prentice J. Callaway. Below them, the trust documents. Below those, a retainer letter from Arthur Merritt, paid in full with a note in Prentice's handwriting. In the margin, Marin will call. Be ready. At the bottom of the box, a separate envelope. Inside it, a single folded page in Prentice's hand. Marin, the combination of the safe is your birthday the way I always write it, because your birthday is the day this whole thing started making sense to me. I don't mean the trust. I mean the reason for it. Call Merritt when you're ready. He has been waiting. I love you more than this journal can hold. She sat with the letter until her hand stopped shaking. Then she called Arthur Merritt. He answered on the second ring. It was past 3 in the morning. He answered like a man who had left the phone beside the bed because he had been expecting this call. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I've been hoping to hear from you." "I found everything," she said. "The patents, the journal, all of it." "Good." A brief pause, the pause of a man checking a mental list. "Then you understand the situation, and you understand that your family will not accept this quietly." "They're planning to demolish the shed," Alton said. 2 weeks. "I have injunctions prepared. The moment any equipment approaches your property, we have grounds for immediate legal action. I'll have a team in position before sunrise." Another pause. "Miss Calloway, I want you to know something. Prentice came to me a year before he died and sat in my office for 2 hours describing what he had built. Not the money, the why of it. He wanted me to understand the intention before I handled the mechanics. In 30 years of practice, no client has ever done that." Marin pressed her free hand flat against the journal cover. "He also told me," Merritt continued, "that whoever chose the shed would either call me that same night or first thing the following morning. He said if it was you, it would be the same night." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. "Get some rest if you can," Merritt said. "Tomorrow will require you to be steady." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her lap. Wade's video was still circulating. Her notifications were a steady stream of mockery family members she had grown up alongside, sharing a laugh at her expense with whoever happened to be watching. Simone had posted a poll: shed or cash, who chooses the shed? 312 votes. Shed was at 4%. Marin turned the phone face down. She lay down on the old canvas cot she found folded behind the door, pulled her jacket over her like a blanket, and for a while she stared at the ceiling of the shed where Prentice had spent 40 years working in quiet, and she felt the weight of what she had been handed, not the money but the story and the question underneath the story, which was the same question Prentice had asked himself in a rented room in Davenport in 1967. Does this matter? Is any of this going to matter? She had typed and deleted 2 messages to Gretchen before she fell asleep. The first had said, "I think I made a mistake." She had deleted it because it was not true or not fully true, and she did not want to put an untruth into the world, even in a message she never sent. The second had said, "I don't know what I'm doing." She had deleted that one too for the opposite reason. It was too true. It was the kind of thing that once spoken aloud has a weight that is hard to set back down. What she settled on, in the end, was not sending anything at all. She closed the phone and turned onto her side on the canvas cot and listened to the November wind, finding the gaps in the shed's old walls, and thought about Prentice sitting at this workbench for 40 years, asking the same question she was asking now and answering it each morning by coming back. She was nearly asleep when her phone lit up with a text from an unsaved number. She almost didn't read it. Then something made her look. The text read, "Miss Calloway, this is Harold Paxton. I want you to know that the will you heard today reflects exactly and completely what your grandfather intended. I am telling you this because you may need to know it in the coming days. I will explain when the time is right. Get some rest." She stared at that message for a long time. Harold Paxton, who had drafted the will, who had paused fractionally on the last page, who had moved his head in a gesture so small that no one else in the room had caught it. Get some rest. She set the phone down. Outside, the wind had quieted. The farmhouse light was out. The night was cold and still, and the shed stood in the middle of it, full of secrets that had been waiting 40 years for the right person to read them. She slept. She woke at 5 to the sound of vehicles on the dirt road. 3 black SUVs moving slowly, stopping 200 meters out, killing their lights. She watched from the shed window. Professional, discreet, Merritt's people. At 6, she photographed every page of every document in the box, uploaded the files to 3 separate cloud accounts, and mailed hard copies to Gretchen's address from the 24-hour postal drop in town. She was back at the shed by 7. At 7:45, she heard the flatbed. She stepped outside. The morning was still and bitterly cold, her breath visible in the gray light. She stood in front of the shed door in jeans and a work jacket, hair pulled back, looking to all appearances exactly like what they expected to find a young woman who had made a bad choice and was now standing in front of the evidence of it. Alton came first, stepping out of the Mercedes with a champagne bottle in one hand, in the expansive looseness of a man who has slept well and expects the day to confirm his confidence. He saw Marin, and his expression moved through surprise into something warmer. almost affectionate, the warmth of a winner who can afford to be generous. Marin, you actually stayed. Isadora was already on her phone. Wade had his out horizontally. Simone and Brooks followed all of them, moving with the comfortable momentum of people arriving at an event. Leland came last. He had driven alone again. He stood slightly apart from the others, watching Marin with the same quality of attention he had shown the day before. Not amusement, assessment. Franklin Tully emerged from Isadora's Range Rover with his leather briefcase and his practiced expression. Miss Calloway, he said, moving toward her with the brisk purpose of a man whose professional role gives him permission to lead. On behalf of the family, I want to make one final offer before we proceed. $100,000 for the parcel. Clean, immediate, no conditions. Marin looked at him. Yesterday you told the attorney this land had no development potential. A beat. Fractional. The same beat she had noted the day before. Market conditions shift quickly. We've had time to review the full picture. I'm sure you have, she said. Then Arthur Merritt stepped out of the lead SUV. I was 58, gray-suited, and had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who are never in a hurry because they have done the preparation that makes hurry unnecessary. Two attorneys flanked him. Two uniformed deputies from the Johnson County Sheriff's Office walked behind them. Alton stared. Who are you? Arthur Merritt and Associates. I represent Miss Marin Calloway. He handed Alton a folded document. That is a restraining order issued at 3 this morning by the Johnson County District Court prohibiting any demolition, alteration, or encroachment on this property. The parcel was legally deeded to Miss Calloway as a condition of Prentice Calloway's will. Any attempt by any party to interfere with that property constitutes criminal trespass and destruction of private assets. Alton, read the document. The color in his face shifted. This is a shed, a condemned shed. What assets? Marin stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not produce documents or photographs or the dramatic flourish that the moment might have warranted. She simply stood in front of the people who had laughed at her 24 hours ago and spoke in the same tone her grandfather had used when explaining something that did not require emphasis because it was simply true. Grandpa Prentice spent 8 years developing an industrial water filtration system. He licensed those patents across 40 years and deposited every dollar of royalties into a private trust account that none of you knew existed. The current balance is $847 million. The champagne bottle left Alton's hand. It hit the gravel and broke, and the sound of it was very clean in the cold morning air. Every original document, Marin continued, the patents, the trust instruments, the licensing agreements is in a safe under the floor of this shed. If you had demolished it this morning, you would have destroyed the physical foundation of my inheritance. No one spoke. The flatbed truck sat 40 yards away with its engine idling, the driver watching through the windshield without expression. Merritt set his briefcase on the hood of the nearest vehicle and opened one. Prentice anticipated this situation in considerable detail. In addition to the legal protections already in place, he retained our firm 18 months ago at a cost of $2 million fully prepaid. Any litigation against Miss Calloway's inheritance will be met with the full resources of that retainer. Marin looked at Leland. The journal, she said, has an entry from August 2019. It describes a phone call. You told him he was sitting on land that could benefit the whole family. You introduced him to Franklin Tully. You told him he wasn't thinking about the people who would come after him. She paused. He wrote that he was doing exactly that, thinking about the people who would come after him. That's why he said no. Leland had gone very still. Tully picked up his briefcase, walked to Isadora's Range Rover, opened the door and got in. He did not say goodbye. He did not look at anyone. That was the moment Alton's face completed its change from confidence to comprehension. The full comprehension. The kind that arrives not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a change in the atmosphere of a moment. $800 million, he said. The words came out quietly, almost carefully, as if he were testing whether they would hold their meaning if spoken aloud. Merritt corrected him without inflection. $847 million. Was in this shed, Alton finished. We were going to demolish it. We brought champagne. Wade had lowered his phone. He was no longer filming. Simone had her hand over her mouth, and it was not to cover a smile this time. The documents, Merritt said to the deputies, are secured. We're done here for this morning. Leland had not moved. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man managing something he had not prepared for. When the deputies began moving people back toward their vehicles, Leland took one step toward Marin. "This isn't finished," he said, quiet, just for her. She met his eyes. "I know," she said. She watched his car back down the dirt road and disappear into the tree line. She watched the flatbed turn around and follow. She watched Alton stand beside his Mercedes for a long moment, staring at the ground before he got in and drove away without speaking to anyone. She'd went back inside the shed. Merritt followed her in. "That went as expected," he said. "Leland will not let this rest. I want you to be prepared for the next stage. He'll go after the will," she said. "He'll go after Prentice's capacity. He'll argue that a man of 84 in declining health couldn't have been making fully considered legal decisions. It's a standard approach, and it can be effective if he finds the right medical witness." Merritt paused. "What he doesn't know is that Prentice anticipated it. There's something in the documents. Prentice required a full cognitive assessment 18 months ago, administered independently and documented thoroughly. His scores were exceptional for any age. The results are in the files you found." He looked at Marin steadily. "But there is someone else who may be more important than any document. Someone Prentice mentioned to me by name." 3 hours later, as Marin was sitting on the cot rereading sections of the journal, she heard a knock at the shed door. She had not heard a car approach on the gravel. She opened the door. Nadine Graves was 74 years old, and she was standing on the threshold of Prentice Calloway's shed with a tin box under one arm and the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place she was always going to set it down. "I told you," she said, "that your grandfather was the best secret keeper I ever knew." She held up the box. "He was the second best. I'm the first." She came inside and sat down on the single wooden stool near the workbench and set the tin box on the bench between them. Inside it were photographs from the early 1970s, technical notes in Prentice's handwriting, and a small appointment diary filled with close, careful script. "I was his secretary at Davenport Chemical from 1973 to 1979, Nadine said. "I typed every one of those patent applications. He paid me from his own pocket in cash because he didn't want a paper trail that the company could follow. He sat me down before the first one and he said, 'Nadine, I'm going to ask you to keep something confidential for a long time, maybe a very long time.' And I said, 'How long is a long time?' And he said, 'Until someone who needs this more than I do needs to prove something.'" Marin looked at the appointment diary. "What's in there?" "His working calendar for 2022. Every meeting with Merritt, every meeting with his financial trustee, every appointment with his independent physician." Nadine opened the diary to a marked page and set it on the bench so Marin could read it. 3 months before he died, he was keeping a schedule that most 50-year-olds would find demanding. Every entry is in his handwriting. Every one is dated. She looked at Marin directly. "If Leland Calloway stands up in any court in this state and argues that your grandfather lacked the mental capacity to make informed legal decisions, I will get on that stand and I will bring this box and I will describe every conversation we had in 6 years of working together, and I will account for every meeting in that calendar. And Leland will not find a jury in Iowa that believes him." Marin stood very still. "Prentice told you," she said, "about the trust, about what he was planning. He told me in 2019 after Leland called him about the East parcel. He said, 'Nadine, I think the timeline is moving faster than I expected. I need to know you're ready.'" She folded her hands in her lap. "I told him I'd been ready for 46 years. I just needed him to ask." 4 days later, Leland called. It was early morning, the sky outside still dark, and Marin was in the shed sorting through the last of the documents when the phone rang. Leland's voice had shed something overnight. The professional smoothness, the considered pacing. What came through the phone was older and less managed. "Brennan and Associates withdrew from the case this morning," he said, "after they reviewed the materials your attorney sent." Marin waited. "I want to tell you something." A long pause, the kind that contains more than one draft of what comes next. "I called him in 2019, my father, and I said what I said about the land, about the family benefiting." His voice was flat with the effort of honesty. "What I didn't say, what I told myself I didn't need to say, was that I hadn't spoken to him in 4 months before that call. I called him because Tully put together a valuation, and I saw numbers that seemed significant, and I picked up the phone for the first time in 4 months because of numbers." Marin sat down on the cot. "The journal," Leland said. What he wrote about the bicycle. Yes, he remembered that. He remembered everything about everyone, she said. That's what he did. Another long pause. The sound of a city morning in Chicago somewhere behind his voice. I'm going to ask you something that I have no right to ask, he said. And I want you to know that I understand that. Ask it. Is there anything left of him in that shed? Not documents, not patents, just him. Marin looked around the shed, the pegboard with the tool outlines, the workbench where he had stood for decades making things, the beam with the carved daisy, the floor that looked ordinary from above and held an entire life beneath it. Yes, she said, there's a lot of him here. Come and see it someday. Not yet, but someday. Leland said nothing, but he stayed on the line for another few seconds before he hung up, and in those seconds, Marin could hear him sitting with something he had been avoiding for a long time, finally beginning to look at it. She set the phone down. She opened the journal to the last entry she had not yet let herself read. The one dated 3 days before he died. She had been saving it the way you save the last page of something you are not ready to finish. She read it now, and when she reached the final line, she closed the journal and sat with her hand flat on the cover for a long time. The line read, I wonder if she knows that every right choice a person makes is really just one person trusting another person enough to make it. I hope she knows. I think she does. I think that's the whole thing, actually. That's always been the whole thing. Outside the shed window, a car she did not recognize was coming slowly down the dirt road toward the eastern boundary of Callaway Creek. It was not Leland. It was not Merritt. It was not anyone from the family. She did not know who it was. She did not know what they wanted. She only knew that the door of the shed was open and she was in it, and that whatever came next was hers to meet. The car that came down the dirt road was a 10-year-old Civic with a cracked side mirror and a trunk that did not sit flush. It stopped 20 yards from the shed, and a young man got out slowly the way people get out of cars when they are not sure they have arrived at the right place or are not sure they will be welcome if they have. I was perhaps 26. Dark hair, work jacket too thin for November. The particular exhaustion that settles into a person's posture after months of sleeping in the same position, in the same small space. He stood beside the car and looked at the shed and then at Marin standing in the doorway, and he said nothing for a moment. Someone at the shelter on 5th told me about this place, he said finally. Said you help people. Said you don't ask a lot of questions first. That's right, Marin said. I don't have anything. I mean nothing. I lost my job in April, and I've been in the car since June, and I don't even know what kind of help I'm supposed to ask for. I just know I needed to stop somewhere. Marin stepped back from the doorway. Come inside, it's cold. His name was Forrest Webb. He had been a junior accountant at a logistics firm in Cedar Rapids until the firm dissolved in a bankruptcy that no one had seen coming, or perhaps everyone had seen coming and no one had said. He had paid his last month of rent and then lived in the Civic while he applied for positions he did not get. And the gap between who he had been and what he had become had widened quietly until it was the whole of his life. Marin made him coffee on the small electric kettle she had bought for the shed and sat with him while he drank it, and she listened the way her grandfather had taught her to listen, without the small interjections that signal impatience, without the instinct to solve before the problem has been fully spoken. When Forrest had finished, she said, I have a job coach coming Thursday and a financial counselor on Fridays, both free. Can you come back Thursday? He looked at her. Just like that. Just like that. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, holding the cup. What is this place, I mean? What's it supposed to be? Marin looked around the shed at the workbench and the pegboard and the carved beam in the corner, at the floor that looked ordinary from above. It's supposed to be exactly what it is right now, she said. After Forrest left, she stood in the open doorway for a while. The November sky had the wash quality of late afternoon blue going to gray at the edges. The farmhouse was visible through the trees a quarter-mile away, its windows dark. Alton was in Des Moines. Isadora had flown back to Chicago. The tractor that Leland had received in the settlement sat under its tarp near the barn. The property had returned to something like quiet, but the shed was not quiet, not anymore. 2 weeks after the morning of the confrontation, Arthur Merritt called Marin to his office in Iowa City to walk her through the trust transfer. The meeting took 4 hours. She sat across from a wealth management team and listened to the structure of what she had been given, not just the amount, but the architecture of it, the careful design that had made it grow rather than simply accumulate. The patents had 17 years of active protection remaining. The trust itself was structured across three separate entities for tax efficiency, managed by a board of independent trustees that Prentice had selected and pre-approved years before his death. At the end of the meeting, when the attorneys were gathering their materials, Merritt stayed behind. "There's one more thing," he said. He set an envelope on the table. "Prentice gave this to me 18 months ago with instructions to deliver it to you at this meeting after the transfer was complete." Marin looked at the envelope, her name in Prentice's handwriting. "I was very specific about the timing," Merritt said. "Not before, at this meeting, when it was done." She opened it after Merritt left the room. Inside was a single page, and the handwriting was steadier than the journal entries from November, which meant Prentice had written this in the earlier part of his last year when he still had the full command of his hands. "Marin, if you are reading this, everything worked. Not the trust, not the patents. Those are just numbers. I mean the thing that matters. You chose without knowing. You stayed without being asked. You trusted without proof. Those three things are the inheritance. The money is just what the inheritance buys. I want to tell you something that I never found the right moment to say out loud, and I am sorry it took a letter to do it. When your mother was dying, she asked me if I would look after you. Not financially. She knew I would do that. She asked me if I would make sure you knew you were worth looking after. I told her yes. I spent the next 21 years trying to keep that promise without you knowing I was keeping it. I hope I did all right. I hope the summers at Callaway Creek were enough. I hope the engineering books and the 2 o'clock conversations and the carved daisy were enough. I think they were. I think you are enough. I think you have always been enough. That is what I most wanted you to know. Use what I built to help people who need to be reminded of the same thing. That's all. That's the whole instruction." She sat alone in the conference room for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table and moved slowly the way light moves in November, without hurry, without apology. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket next to where she had been carrying the brass key. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built in real time, which was appropriate because that is exactly what they were. Marin hired a restoration contractor with specific instructions. Restore the shed's exterior to its original condition, meaning the 1970s working workshop that Prentice had built with his own hands, and convert the interior into a functional community space without erasing what it had been. The contractor, a woman named Pauline who had grown up in Johnson County and understood what old farm buildings meant to the people who built them, took the instructions seriously. The exterior came back slowly, plank by plank. The weathered wood cleaned and reinforced rather than replace the roof line, corrected the foundation sealed. From 50 yards away, it still looked like a working shed on the edge of an Iowa farm. That was intentional. Inside, the workbenches along the walls became the basis for a technical instruction space. Prentice's tools stayed mounted in their original positions on the pegboard, but behind glass now with small type cards explaining what each one was and what it had been used for. The floor was refinished. New lighting came in warm and direct. The safe remained in place under the floor, now accessed through a hinged panel, rather than a hidden mechanism preserved as part of the history of the space with a single folded note inside in Prentice's handwriting that Merritt had returned to Marin after the transfer was complete. It said, "Only you found it. Good." On the east wall above the original workbench where Prentice had stood for decades, Marin hung a photograph she found in Nadine's tin box. Prentice in 1976, standing in front of this same shed, holding a wrench, squinting slightly into the sun, wearing the expression of a man who has just solved a problem that took longer than expected and is quietly satisfied about it. He was 34 years old in the photograph. He looked like someone who knew what he was doing. Below the photograph, she placed a single line from the journal printed in simple type on a piece of milled oak. "Real wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what you build that stays useful after you are gone." The foundation, she established the Prentice J. Callaway Community Center, opened in February. Gretchen Bellows organized the nursing scholarship program and taught the first class herself. A retired engineer from Ames ran the technical mentorship sessions on Saturdays. Wade Pruitt, who had said almost nothing since the morning at the shed, showed up 3 weeks before the opening and asked quietly if he could be useful. And because he was a very good accountant and the foundation needed one, Marin said yes. But before the center's grand opening, something else happened that Marin had not planned for. 2 days before the ribbon was cut, Franklin Tully appeared at the door of Merritt's office. He came without his briefcase, without his practiced handshake expression, and he sat down across from Marin with the manner of a man who had been working up to something for several weeks and had finally decided to stop delaying it. "I need to tell you the full truth," he said. "I knew about the patents before Prentice died. A former employee at Davenport Chemical sold me the information in 2018. Not the full picture, but enough to understand that the East parcel was valuable in a way no one in the family had calculated. When Leland contacted me in 2019, I already knew what we were circling. I helped him design the approach. The demolition plan was mine as much as his." Marin said nothing. "I also want you to know," Tully continued, "that when Prentice turned us down that year, he called me afterward. Not Leland. Me. He said, 'Franklin, I understand what you were trying to do. I'm not angry. But I want you to think about whether you've spent your career making the right things easier or the wrong things smoother.'" He said it without any heat, just a question. Tully set an envelope on the desk between them. "This contains every record of my communications with Leland from 2018 forward. No conditions, no request for anything in return." Merritt took the envelope. Marin looked at Tully for a long moment. "He said that to you," she said, "about making the wrong thing smoother." "He did. I've thought about it every day since." After Tully left, Merritt turned to Marin. "That closes the last open door," he said. "There is nothing left that anyone can use against you." "I know," she said, "but that's not why it matters." One day before the ribbon was cut on the new center, Marin sent formal letters to every member of the family. Not through Merritt's office. In her own handwriting on plain paper delivered by courier. The letter said the same thing to each person: "Come to the shed tomorrow at 4 in the afternoon. There is something that needs to be said in person. Attendance is your choice." They all came. Alton arrived first, 5 minutes early, and stood outside rather than going in, as if he understood that the threshold meant something and was not ready to cross it without permission. Isadora came next alone, without the sunglasses, without the carry-on. Leland drove from Chicago again and parked at the end of the dirt road and walked the last quarter mile, which Marin thought was probably intentional. Wade and Simone arrived together. Brooks came last, slightly breathless, having driven straight from the airport. They stood in the shed in the late afternoon light, all of them, for the first time since the morning of the confrontation. But this was not that morning. The shed was not what it had been. The tools were behind glass. The photograph was on the wall. The floor was clean. The room smelled of sawdust and new wood and coffee from the kettle in the corner. Marin stood in front of Prentice's workbench with Merritt to her left and a folder of documents on the bench beside her. She did not open with an accusation. She did not open with a list of grievances. She had thought a long time about what Prentice would have said in this room, and she had decided that what he would have said was the truth, plainly, without performance. "He wrote about all of you," she said. "Every single one of you. I want you to know that before anything else, not to hurt you, because I think you deserve to know you were on his mind, even in the years when you weren't thinking about him." She opened the journal to a page she had marked with a strip of paper. She did not read from it. She set it on the workbench where anyone who wanted to look could look. "He left each of you exactly what he thought you needed. Alton got the house because Prentice believed that living inside something a man built with his own labor would eventually teach what no law school could. Isadora got the cars because he thought beauty was something she understood, and he wanted her to have the chance to understand what beauty is actually for. Leland got the farm equipment because the last time Prentice felt his eldest son was fully present was in a barn, and he wanted to give him a reason to go back." The room was very quiet. "I wasn't punishing anyone," Marin said. "He was trying to give each of you something true, the same way he always did, without explanation, without fanfare, trusting that the right person would eventually ask the right question." Alton was looking at the photograph. His jaw was tight in the way that men's jaws get when they are holding something in that is trying to come out. Isadora said quietly, "He could have just told us." "He tried," Marin said, "for 30 years. He told me in the journal. He said he explained himself to his children when they were young, and the conclusions they drew were wrong, and by the time he understood that the habit of distance was set." She paused. "That was his regret, not the money, not the shed, the distance." Leland looked up from the floor. "What do you want from us, Marin, specifically?" It was the most honest question he had asked her since before the will reading, and she respected him for it. "I want you to contribute to this foundation." Not because I'm forcing you, not because you're afraid of what I might do if you don't, but because it is the right thing and you are capable of doing it. She slid the folder across the workbench. The amounts are listed inside. They're proportional to what each of you inherited. They're not small. They are fair. She looked at each of them in turn. If you sign, you're not buying my forgiveness. I'm not selling that. You're choosing on your own to do something with what Prentice left you that he would have wanted. No one spoke for a moment. Then Alton pulled the folder toward him. He read the first page without expression. He turned to the second. He set down his pen on the workbench and looked at Marin. He really wrote about teaching me to ride a bike, he said. It was not a question. April 1983, Marin said. You asked him why he didn't let you fall. Alton picked up the pen. He signed. Isadora signed next without hesitation, the signature of a woman who had already decided before she walked through the door. Leland signed with the pen held carefully the way he would have held a tool he was using for the first time and wanted to use correctly. Wade and Simone and Brooks signed together, the cousins who had live-streamed the mockery and were now sitting in the room that proved them wrong, doing the only thing left that made any sense. When the last signature was on the page, nobody celebrated. Nobody shook hands. The room held what it held, which was 6 people who had arrived at the shed that morning in November with champagne and cameras and certainty, and who were leaving it now with something more complicated and more durable than any of that. Leland was the last to go. He stopped at the door and looked back at the photograph one more time. I was 34 when I took that picture, he said. He'd just poured the foundation that morning. He was covered in concrete dust. He made me take the picture anyway. He said, Leland, I want a record of the day this thing started. He was quiet for a moment. I never asked him what thing. I know, Marin said. I'm going to ask better questions, he said, going forward. She believed him. The family came back in pieces after that at different speeds in different ways, but they came back at different speeds in different ways. Alton came on a Sunday in March without calling ahead. He did not come to the shed door. He walked instead to the east side of the property and stood looking at the field, the half-acre that his father had refused to sell, that a flatbed truck had approached with a fully different plan for. He stood there for a while. When he finally came to the door, he looked like he had been doing something effortful. I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting, he told her, that he left me the house because he hoped the building would teach me something. He looked at the workshop walls, the tools, the photograph. I think I understand what he meant. And I think I've been treating everything I've earned like it was already mine before I made it. Marin did not say anything. She let it stand. I wanted to ask if there's anything in the foundation structure that needs legal work. Pro bono, estate planning, and nonprofit governance. It's the kind of thing I'm good at. Send me your information, she said. I'll have Merritt reach out. Isadora called in April. She had sold one of the 3 vintage automobiles, the 1948 Packard, that Prentice had apparently loved most, and used the proceeds to fund the foundation's first annual nursing scholarship. She had done without mentioning it to anyone first, and without asking for recognition in the foundation's materials. Marin found out from Merritt during a routine call. When she called Isadora to say thank you, Isadora was quiet for a moment. He kept those cars covered in a barn and never sold them, even when money was tight in the 90s. I used to think that was sentimental to the point of irrationality. I understand it better now. He was keeping them for a reason. I just thought the reason was the cars. Leland came in May. He drove from Chicago on a Friday evening and arrived at the shed just as Marin was locking up. I was wearing a flannel shirt and khaki pants, and he had left his careful professional posture somewhere on the highway between here and Iowa. He simply stood in the late light and looked at the exterior of the restored shed and said, he built this himself, 1972. I was 13. I helped him pour the foundation, and I remember thinking it was the most boring 2 days of my life. He was quiet. I never asked him what it was for, not once in 50 years. Marin unlocked the door. Come in, she said. I'll show you. She showed him the tools behind glass and the photograph on the wall, and the hinged panel on the floor and the note inside the safe. Leland stood in front of the photograph for a long time. I was 34 there, Marin said. I know, Leland said. I took that picture. She had not known that. He turned away from the photograph and looked at the room. The workshop space, the light coming warm through the restored windows. He would like this, Leland said. He would like it very much. I think so too. I'm sorry, Marin. He said it without preamble, without the professional management she had heard in his voice since the will reading. Just the words carrying the weight he had been carrying since the morning at the shed. For 2019, for the attorney, for all of it, for 30 years of only calling when I wanted something. He did leave you something, she said. Leland looked at her. He left you the equipment, the tractors and the tools. He wrote about it in the journal. He said you learned to maintain engines before you learned to read, that you had a feel for mechanical things that none of the others had. He said he hoped that when you were standing in the barn looking at those machines, you would remember who taught you. She paused. He didn't leave you the equipment to give you a tractor. He left it to give you a reason to remember being 13 and learning something real. Leland was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and rougher than she had ever heard it. Can I come back on Saturday? He said. The engineering students. Yes. I don't need to be introduced as anything. I can just be someone who knows about machines. That's all anyone needs to be, she said. He came back on Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. By June, he had taken on a regular session with a group of community college students studying mechanical engineering, and he taught without the formality of a man performing expertise with the ease of someone who had spent their early life in barns and had only recently remembered that this was a skill rather than a background detail. The revelation about Harold Paxton came in June, 6 months after the will reading from Paxton himself. He called Marin on a Tuesday morning and asked if he could come by. He arrived at the shed with a folder of documents in the manner of a man clearing an account that had been open too long. I need to tell you something that I probably should have told you sooner, he said. Leland Calloway contacted me 6 weeks before Prentice died. He asked me to revise certain provisions of the will, specifically the provision that offered you a choice rather than a direct bequest. He argued that the choice mechanism was evidence of cognitive decline, that a man in full command of himself would simply leave things to people directly rather than constructing tests. He asked me to replace it with a standard distribution. Marin kept her eyes on him. I declined, Paxton said. Leland told me he would file a complaint with the Bar Association for what he called compromise neutrality. I told him he was welcome to do that. He did not. A pause. What I want you to understand is that Prentice knew Leland would try something like this. He told me at our very first meeting, 18 months before his death, that one of his sons would attempt to intervene in the will before it was executed. He said, Harold, when that happens, I want you to hold the line. He had already prepared documentation to defend against any challenge. He had already retained Merritt as a parallel protection. He had already arranged for Nadine Graves to be available as a witness. Your grandfather built redundancy into everything. He did not leave things to chance. The knot, Marin said. Paxton looked at her. At the will reading, when I chose the shed, you moved your head. I was quiet for a moment. Prentice told me that if you chose the shed, he wanted you to have one moment of confirmation before the room finished laughing. One moment where someone who knew the whole story acknowledged what you had just done. He picked up the folder and handed it to her. These are the records of Leland's contact with my office and my formal declination. Prentice asked me to give them to you when the time was right. Marin held the folder. She thought about Prentice sitting across from Harold Paxton, 18 months before his death, methodically arranging the pieces of something he would not live to see completed, accounting for every person who might move against it, building the defenses before the attack came, not out of bitterness, out of the same quality of attention he had brought to every engineering problem for 50 years. Identify the failure modes, build the protections, make it so that the thing you are building is stronger than any single person's ability to break it. Hyatt built it that way because he believed what he was building was worth that much care. Hyatt believed she was worth that much care. She sat with Paxton for another hour going through the documents. By the time she walked him to his car, the evening was coming in from the east, and the Iowa sky was doing the thing it does in June, turning colors that have no good names and do not stay long. One more thing, Paxton said, pausing at his car door. Prentice said something at our last meeting that I have thought about many times since. He said, Harold, the hardest thing about building something for someone else is that you have to trust them to finish it. You do all the preparation you can, but at some point the thing leaves your hands. He told me he had made his peace with it because of Marin, because of the specific quality of attention she brought to things. He said she was the only person he had ever met who could look at a technical diagram and find it worth sitting with for an hour. He got in his car and drove down the dirt road and turned out of sight. Marin stood in front of the shed in the June evening and let the quiet settle around her. Forrest Webb came back on Thursday as he had promised. He came back the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that, and by March he had completed the foundation's job readiness program and accepted a position at a small accounting firm in Iowa City. The morning he came to say goodbye, he was wearing a pressed shirt and shoes that had been recently polished, the particular care of a person re-entering a world they had been afraid they might not get back to. On his last Thursday, he found Marin in the workshop section and stood in front of Prentice's photograph for a moment before he spoke. "I don't know how to say thank you for something this size," he said. "You don't have to," Marin said. "Just come back sometime and help someone else." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Marin could see him working out whether to say the next thing. He said it. "When I drove up that first day, I almost turned around 3 times. I kept thinking what kind of place just helps people without asking anything first. What's the catch?" He looked at the photograph. There was no catch. "No," she said. "Who is he?" "My grandfather. He built this place." Forrest looked at the image for another moment. "He looks like someone who knew what he was doing." "He did," she said. "He really did." Nadine Graves was there that day too, as she was most Saturdays now. She had become a quiet fixture of the center, arriving early, making coffee, sitting in on whatever session was running with the attentiveness of someone who had spent a career taking notes and never entirely stopped. She and Marin had developed the specific ease of two people who share a large secret that has been successfully kept and can now simply be the fact of who they are to each other. After Forrest left, Nadine found Marin in the doorway watching his car back down the dirt road. "Prentice would have liked that young man," Nadine said. "He would have asked him 100 questions, Marin said. Nadine smiled. "He always did. That was how you knew he was interested. He stopped asking questions about the people who stopped interesting him." She paused. "He never stopped asking about you. Not once in all the years I knew him. Every time I saw him, he had a new question about what you were doing and what you were thinking and whether you were all right." Marin looked out at the road where Forrest's car had gone. "He could have just told me," she said. It was the same thing Isadora had said in the shed a month before. Marin understood now why Isadora had said it. Some truths are easier to hold once you can say them out loud. "He showed you," Nadine said. "Some men don't have the words, but they have the work. He showed you for 22 years. You just had to learn how to read it." Marin thought about that for a long time after Nadine had gone inside. She thought about the engineering texts and the 2 o'clock conversations and the carved daisy and the key and the combination that was her birthday. She thought about a man who had spent 40 years building something in a shed on the eastern edge of his property and had never once needed to explain why, because the why was always going to be legible to the right person when the time came. She had been the right person. She had found the time. A year after Prentice's death on a Tuesday in November, Marin came to the shed alone before the morning sessions began. She had a ritual by then. She came early before anyone else arrived, and she made coffee and sat in the workshop section and looked at the photograph and the tools and the room her grandfather had built, and then let become something else. Something that kept building itself every time a new person walked through the door. She found the note by accident. She was moving a heavy storage box from the southeast corner of the room, the corner she had never had a reason to clear before, because the old equipment stored there had stayed through every renovation without being in anyone's way. When she lifted the box, the floor beneath it was different from the surrounding planks. Newer wood, and taped to the underside of the box with a strip of adhesive that had yellowed and gone brittle with time, was a folded piece of paper. Prentice's handwriting, no date. She unfolded it. "Marin, if you are reading this, you moved the box in the southeast corner. You are cleaning up, making space. Good. That means the place is being used and you need more room for what comes next. That is exactly what I hoped for. I want to tell you the thing I could not put in the journal because the journal was a record, and this is a letter. The journal was for understanding the past. This is for the future. In 1967, I sat in a rented room in Davenport and asked myself whether what I was working on would matter. I did not know the answer. I kept working anyway, not because I was confident, but because I could not find a good reason to stop. I have come to believe after a great many years that this is the only honest engine for the long work. Not certainty, not the guarantee of outcome, just the inability to locate a sufficient reason to put it down. You will have mornings when you look at what is happening in this building and ask whether it matters, whether the people you are helping are actually helped whether the work is real, whether the foundation is what you meant it to be, or something smaller and more ordinary than you hoped. Those mornings are not a warning. They are the work. The only thing I know about the kind of person who builds something that lasts is that they do not stop asking the question. They just learn to keep working while they wait for the answer. That is what I am leaving you, not the answer. The question and the habit of returning to it, and the understanding that the returning is itself the whole of the task. I love you more than I knew how to say out loud. I hope the summers were enough. I think they were. I think you are. She sat down on the floor of the shed in the corner where she had found the note with her back against the wall, and the morning light coming through the windows that had been cleaned and refitted and now let in whatever Iowa had to offer. She sat there for a long time, not crying, not exactly, doing the thing that comes after crying, the thing that happens when grief and gratitude and love arrive at the same moment from different directions, and there is no single name for what results. She thought about a 7-year-old sitting on this floor with an engineering text she could not understand. She thought about Prentice standing at the bench above her, working answering questions, teaching someone who did not yet know she was being taught. She thought about 40 years of quiet work of a trust fund growing in the dark, like something planted in winter that no one could see from the outside. She thought about the key, the weight of it in her pocket on that first night. She took it out now. She had stopped wearing it around her neck in March when the foundation opened because it felt like the right time to let it be what it actually was. A key, a small brass key that opened a lock. The lock was open, had been open for months. The safe was empty of secrets now. Everything that had been in it was in the world doing what it had been built to do. She walked to the workbench and opened the drawer at the base of the tool display, the shallow drawer she had fitted with felt lining when she installed the glass panels above. She set the key inside next to the brass compass Prentice had used to draw technical circles in the small spirit level he had owned since before she was born. She closed the drawer. By 8 o'clock, the first cars were on the dirt road. The Saturday engineering students arrived in a cluster, stomping mud from their boots at the door. Leland's rental was behind them. Gretchen's car pulled in as Marin was propping the door open, and the morning was cold and clear and full of the particular quality of a November day in Iowa that has decided to be beautiful despite everything. Gretchen came in carrying 2 coffees and handed one to Marin without asking. "How are you doing?" she said. "Good," Marin said. And then because it was Gretchen, and because it was true, I found another note from him. Gretchen looked at her for a moment. "How many is that?" "3. Maybe there are more, I don't know." She looked at the room filling up around them, the students settling at the workbenches. Leland nodding to someone he recognized from last week, the morning arranging itself into its ordinary pattern. I think he left them in places I would find when I was ready to find them. Not all at once, one at a time as the building needed them. Gretchen nodded slowly. "What did this one say?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "That the question is the whole of the task," she said. Gretchen looked at her. "It makes sense to me," Marin said. Gretchen held her coffee with both hands and looked at the room the way she had been looking at it all morning, with the frank appreciation of someone seeing it clearly for the first time, despite having been here many times before. "He was a good man," she said finally. Not a eulogy, just the plainest truth offered the way plain truths sometimes are quietly after everything complicated has been said. "How was," Marin said. Outside, the November light came through the windows and moved across the floor of the shed, the way light in November moves unhurried without apology, spending time where it lands. Across the tools on the pegboard, across the photograph of a 34-year-old man squinting into the sun, holding a wrench looking satisfied. Across the faces of the people who had come here because something had drawn them to a place where the door was open and no one asked questions before help was offered. Marin thought about the note she had found that morning. She thought about all 3 notes, actually the one in the safe and the one in the transfer envelope, and this one under the box in the southeast corner, placed in order of when she would need them. The first when she was still uncertain. The second when it was done. The third when it was going, and she needed to be reminded why it was worth continuing. He had known her that well. He had known her in the way that you can only know someone you have been paying attention to for 22 years without any agenda other than love. Not love that needed to be stated. Love that showed up every summer and answered every question and carved a small flower into a beam so that the right person would find it at the right time. She had been the right person. She had been worth that much attention and that much patience and that much faith. Prentice Calloway had built a shed in 1972 and worked in it alone for 40 years and left it to someone who would know what it was for. She knew what it was for. She picked up a coffee and walked into the room to begin the morning.